And Sarah, if you can send Braylon the new link.
Ah, okay.
Tim, can Cindy begin?
Yes.
Oh, you're
Well, good morning or good afternoon. And thank you so much for holding out, the people who have waited for us to be able to get back on. I wanted to start with a moment of silence, which may be a good way to just center us for a moment. And I want to tell you what this moment of silence is for. I spoke at a Montessori conference in South Africa this past week, and one of the things that got shared is that it is not typical, rare at most, to find a school that has a Black Montessori teacher and a white assistant. That you will see a white Montessori teacher and a Black assistant. And in the townships, you will see a Black Montessori teacher and a Black assistant. But it just does not happen that you would find a Black Montessori teacher and a white assistant. And so this moment of silence is for equality and equity and a shift up in our field and in what we do and who we are, so that it is reflective of the entire world as Dr. Montessori saw it. Thank you. So today we were going to do some homework and some truth-telling and some storytelling and some inward feeling. And I'm hoping that we can all be vulnerable enough to make this a safe space for everyone to just speak as they need to speak. One of the pieces of homework that we mentioned before, if you were on before, was that we wanted you to take the Harvard Bias Test. And know that if you missed out, it's okay, because I'm going to ask everyone to keep taking it anyway. And I'll explain why in a little bit. And some of the other homework that we had been given was reading homework, to read, if you could get a copy, how to be an anti-racist, and a book that might have to do with white privilege or white fragility, something that is like that. So I just wanted to start by opening it up to find out if anyone had done any of those things and just how you were feeling, either what came up for you taking the Harvard Bias Test, anything out of the readings that you have been doing, or anything that you may have seen of late, and just how that's hit you.
Cindy, I'll start. I teach a class at the college teaching cultural diversity, and I use maybe atypical books. For example, Race Matters, Cornell West. I use Tim Wise's book, White Like Me. And I talk about Dyson over at Georgetown University and race relations, and how that affects our children, even at a very young age, even though it digresses a bit from the California standard, but they need to know background information before they can teach children and know a little bit about their own biases that they come with.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. Any other thoughts someone has?
I'm new to the group, so thank you for hosting. And I'm James McGee from Miami, Florida. I'm looking up the Harvard Bias Test, and I'm getting Project Implicit. Is that the one I should be looking for?
Yes.
Thank you.
Sure, absolutely. And Monica Johnson, you said you've completed White Fragility and started reading the new Jim Crow. Oh, yes. And you've taken several bias tests. Do you want to comment about your thoughts from the readings or from the test, Monica?
Sure. So actually, along with a coworker of mine, we read White Fragility together, and then have had conversations all the way throughout the text. Her sister also read it, so it was sort of like a book club, but unofficial. And one of the women in the small little group was in the military, so we spent a lot of time talking about how the military is sort of a microcosm that has all of the same kinds of issues that were talked about in the book just within the military. So we kind of went off on a tangent with White Fragility based on her experience in the military. Really loved it though. And the new Jim Crow, we just started that one, and the author wrote a new foreword to it. I don't know if anybody's read the new Jim Crow before, but if you go on, I think it's Google Library, it's the one where it's an audiobook, so that's the way I'm listening to it. And she has updated the foreword, it's really powerful. And I just actually finished listening to her read the new foreword to the book, The New Jim Crow. My passion has always been surrounding that, dismantling that school to prison pipeline. And so I really am feeling this book coming up, The New Jim Crow. As far as the project implicit bias tests, I was actually super shocked at one of them that I took, which is the ageism. So I know that there are several bias tests, but the ageism. So I do actually, I was shocked because I came out biased for people like maybe older people, thinking that they're maybe frail or not as capable. And it's interesting because I've worked in places where I've cared for the elderly, but then I've also done social things, like maybe I've joined a knitting club, or I've been involved in, bringing students from my class to go and do art projects. And so it hasn't been like a negative experience for me, but for some reason I have that bias that they're not capable or they're fragile. And so I was shocked at that, actually. I kind of was upset. I was accusing the test in the beginning of not being correct, but really interesting to see that bias in myself.
And to know that you're human, because we all have a bias. Yes, we all have a bias.
Right.
Tanya.
Thank you, Cindy, so much for guiding us in our personal work and in our group work and in our community work. So the story I have to share is I was so inspired by the tests and the data that I started my implicit bias diary. And I'm handwriting all which tests I take. I've taken, I think at record now 10 or 11, and the data and the percentage, where I fall in the percent category. So far what's really resonating is that nothing's surprised me about my biases. I'm pretty much, I have the same biases I had 30 years ago when I did some anti-bias work with a Baha'i community. The Baha'i community led a very intensive, and some of those implicit biases that I have, they've gotten less than, so I'm in the slight category. But the one I'm most proud of, because I have dedicated my work to gender equality a lot of times, especially in education, especially as relates to math and science. And that one was neutral. So I was very happy to get, I'm working, but it's been 30 years of hard work. And so we can never not underestimate the daily commitment to this kind of work. And I'm certainly open to answering any questions from anyone about some of the other results I got in some of the, I took skin color, I took race, I took gender, I took religions, I took able-bodied, I took ageism. I mean, I'm working it. So thank you for letting me share.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Good work around that. Karen.
Hi, this is my first time here too, so thank you for doing this, and
Oh, absolutely.
wonderful. I was wondering if I could just something I recently read just a couple days ago in the New York Times that really moved me. I'm looking forward to doing the reading and the homework that you guys just mentioned, but just this really caused me to pay attention was the opinion piece by Caroline Randall Williams. You want a Confederate monument? My body is a Confederate monument. It was one of the most powerful pieces of writing that I've read for a very long time. I just wanted to mention it.
Yes, it's an excellent piece. Really excellent piece.
Well, thank you for being here.
Thank you. Anyone else? Sarah, do you see something in the chat? You're on mute.
Okay, and I just put in a link to the Confederate Monument article so that people could see that. Let's see, Laura Rabolo, are you there? Do you want to, Laura says, Latinx guide now, stay at home mama. I'm finishing up White Fragility and it gives me a better understanding of where the intolerance or racist comments from whites I see on social media whites are stemming from. I understand better the defensiveness of whites, by whites. Do you want to speak to that, Laura? I'm not sure.
Maybe no.
Maybe no, but thank you for sharing. It's
absolutely.
Deep understanding. It's enlightenment.
Yeah.
For others.
Is there anyone else who wants to speak to something that they've read of late or to the Harvard bias test? Kathleen. Can you unmute?
I read a while ago the story of the two Westmores, and it's a very, very powerful book, contrasting a person who, they both grew up in the same neighborhood, but one's life led into imprisonment and the other one led to a very meaningful life. It's very, it was very hard to read. And my reading has been kind of diverged a bit because my 33-year-old grandson died of a drug overdose on May 9th. And he had been in the prison system, not for long, but was let go because of COVID. Should have gone into a halfway house, which may or may not have been a good thing, but because of COVID, he didn't. And his third day out of prison, he probably took an overdose. He was 33 years old. So I've been reading stories that, one written by a woman whose daughter died at 33 of a heroin overdose. And it's called Even If Your Heart Would Listen. And the other one I'm reading is From Heroin to Hope. A woman who lost her 26-year-old son. And the thing that is so tragic about all of this is that the stories are a blueprint. They read the same. The lack of good mental health care, really the facade of 12-step programs and rehabs and unlicensed halfway houses, and it just goes on and on and on. And it's heartbreaking. And then a friend told me, I said, where do I begin? Where do I begin to deal with the sorrow? And she said she lost her brother to taking his own life. The Wild Edge of Sorrow. It's a ritual of renewal and the sacred work of grief. And this whole inequity between our Black brothers and sisters and us is tearing my heart. So it's grief upon grief. And I'm hoping that this one, it certainly will be broader in scope than the other two that were specific to heroin overdoses. But then I think of the underserved neighborhoods where this is going on, and they don't have the fancy rehabs, that didn't do any good anyway. And the stigma and the attitude and not even bothering to help them. It's really overwhelming. It's just really, really overwhelming. So I know it's a little off topic, but I wanted to share that. And having seen the 13th Amendment, I want to get back into the book that was mentioned. I have it on my shelf now. I can't think of the name of it. About the prison system. Oh, the new Jim Crow. I started reading it a while ago, and now that I'm through these 3 books, or 2.5, I want to that's probably the one I'll read. Because I think it's just, I hear people sentenced to prison, and I think, what are we doing? Like what are we doing? How is that helpful? I don't know. I'm a mess. So thank you for letting me share.
Kathleen, absolutely. Life is so under siege. It's just so under siege right now.
Yeah.
And we need to be able to see the factors that are causing those injustices and the hurt and the devastation that is happening to life, and to stop it now, because people are getting caught in it, and you have lost as the result of that, and I'm so sorry. And I'm so glad you're here.
Well, thank you. I'm glad I'm here too. And I just want to say I listened to, and it's very short, the youth poet laureate, Amanda Gorman, and her poem. She recited it today, I think, on ABC. So articulate, so full of passion, a beautiful, beautiful voice in the midst of all of this. Mm-hmm. So it's a bright spot, it's a bright spot. Mm-hmm. So, thank you.
Absolutely.
Kathleen, if you don't notice it, if you don't have your chat on, there are many condolences coming your way in the chat.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
Here who are very touched by your story.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And, Cindy, I wanted to say that there's Shannon Minch says, my teachers and I are reading White Fragility over the summer and using Robin DiAngelo's reading guide as we read. So that's one school's way of making it be a group effort.
Wonderful. That person is Shannon? Is that what you said?
Shannon Minch.
Shannon, do you want to speak to that at all? I think that's a wonderful happening in your school.
Thank you, Cindy, and Kathleen, my condolences to you. I think piggybacking on what Kathleen is saying, what really isn't off topic. I think all of this comes in layers, and it's all connected, and it's all symptomatic of the bigger systemic racism that we have. And so it's overwhelming. So we picked a book, and this is my first time joining the group, thank you. We picked a book that is challenging, of course, but so important. And I'm from Boulder, and we have one of the highest achievement gaps in the country, because with our affluence, we spend a lot of money to take our high kids and pop them up higher. It's just a challenge, and I think a lot of what we're seeing are symptoms. The police brutality is a symptom of years of racism, and so to go back and go to the foundation of what's happening, because I think we tend to try to put a Band-Aid on what the symptom is and not go back to where does this come from. And I think, you know, the books that Kathleen talked about and Jim Crow and white privilege, it gives people a place to start. And so I did, so I've got a book club going. I did this is interesting, I'm gonna ask again, but I put out the offer to do a book club with my parents also.
Wonderful.
Because that's, but I haven't, interestingly enough, 0 said yes so far. It is a hard book to get, White Fragility, but you still can get it online. But I'm going to try again. I'm going to keep trying because it really has to be a whole community effort to really start tearing apart the systemic racism in schools. So thank you.
Absolutely. You know, it's difficult to get some of these books right now, and I think that speaks wonders about the fact that people are really trying to do the homework. I think that's really, really excellent.
And I just want to say, Cindy, I think even if it's not available in the physical book, many of the e-editions are available and the audio books are available. So even if you want a hard copy, you can start in different ways and get right away. When you assigned that to us, now going back a few weeks ago, I started on how to be an anti-racist, which I am getting through and having to, I hesitate to say enjoying it, but I am savoring it. I'm learning from it, and I'm going back and re-listening to certain parts of it. And I also started on Waking Up White. And so I'm going back and forth between those two. I also have ordered White Fragility, so I have that one. I may have it already here. I just haven't started on because I want to try to just focus in and concentrate on what I'm currently reading. But one of the very profound books I read quite a while ago, was I became a fan of Ta-Nehisi Coates and his, not only his writing style, but his content and what he writes about, and was very, very profoundly moved as a mother. And I think the reason that this topic has become, or was very important to me even prior to this most current events, is that as a mother, I kept thinking to myself, having raised 2 white sons, that why is it that it's so different than for a Black mother? And that felt so viscerally unfair to me for so long. And my children had Black friends, and I had to have conversations that were so different than those Black mothers had to have with their children. And in the one book that Ta-Nehisi wrote, Between the World and Me, I thought it was really helped me as a parent understand from a different perspective, because he, as a Black man, having been raised in a different sort of environment than he was raising his own son, and how he had to struggle with conveying how he was raised, and for his son to take seriously, because his son was raised in a more privileged, affluent lifestyle than he himself was raised. And so it really did, for me, shed a lot of light on my questions about the inequities and how that applies, how it's really so not about money and the privilege. A lot of times when we're talking about privilege, I keep hearing from people, well, I wasn't raised with a lot of wealth. Well, that's not really what we're talking about. And so it just, again, it's just helping me put some pieces together and reflect on my own learning and my own struggle with my sons and how it's so unfair.
Yeah. So Cindy, Cheryl Allen says, I really learned from how to be an anti-racist, and I'm enjoying the conversations around it with so many different types of people. That comes from Cheryl Allen.
So I want you to look at a clip, and Sarah, if you can put on Tim Wise. And I will tell you that Tim Wise is, gosh, how can I explain him? He minces no words. He is a white man who speaks out about race, and he's committed to it and has for years, decades. And he put some spins on things that one just would not have quite considered using research. So, Sarah, if you can.
I've got to get Kathy to turn on screen sharing for me.
I got it. Hold on just a sec. There you go.
Thank you.
Mhm.
And it was Tim Wise, correct?
Yes.
Great. Sorry, I've got to back out for a minute. I forgot to click something.
Should be at the very beginning.
A few years back, white Americans were asked whether or not we believed that racial discrimination was still a significant national problem for people of color, or whether it was just a problem, you know, like junk mail, wrong phone number, 2 in the morning, you can't get back to sleep, it's raining and you want to go outside for a jog, you know, a problem, but one you'll get over, you know. Whether it wasn't much of a problem, wasn't a problem at all, or we just weren't sure. They also asked black and brown folk this question. Folks of color, it won't surprise you, said, yes, it is a significant problem, actually, and not just because I read about it in the sociology textbook. I actually have lived it and would be more than happy to tell you what kind of problem it's been, but these were pollsters, man, they didn't care about that. They just wanted the yes or no, then they were on to the next house. Then they asked white folks, is it or is it not a significant national problem, racial discrimination for people of color and against people of color, and only 6%, 6 out of 100 said yes, that it was a significant national problem. Just to give you an idea of how bad that is, I would have you compare it to a survey taken a few years earlier where approximately 12% of white Americans said we believe there was a fairly decent chance that Elvis Presley might still be alive. I don't know how good you are at math. I'm not very good myself, but that's a ratio that I can calculate. What that means is that white Americans are twice as likely to believe that Elvis might still be alive than we are to believe what people of color tell us they experience on a fairly regular basis. That is denial so profound as to boggle the mind, but there it is. And the people who are saying it are not mean-spirited, they're not hard-hearted, they're not bad people. I firmly believe that most people are good people. I could be wrong about this, but I have 2 little girls, ages 6 and 4, and I choose as a parent to believe that most people are good. If you have evidence to the contrary, keep it to yourself. I do not want to know it or hear it this evening. What I do know is that those individuals who said that, as well-meaning as they may have been, that they really didn't see it as a significant problem, aren't new in their denial. See, it's one thing for young people to think that the problem is solved. I almost get that. I almost understand it, because if you're under the age of 25, maybe even under the age of 35, what you know, what we tend to know, younger people, about this history and about this legacy is what we see in that grainy black and white footage every MLK Day, or maybe during Black History Month. If I were to ask you, do you believe that folks of color had equal opportunity and were treated equally in this country in 1963? Or whether or not black children were treated equally in schools and had equal educational opportunity in 1962, I know right now that no one in here would say, well, of course, you know, naturally they did. 1963, that was a damn good year to be black or brown in America. What are you talking about? Everyone, regardless of your position about 2007, would quickly acknowledge how bad it was back in the day, because it's no sweat off your back. 44, 45 years later, it's easy to talk about how bad it was, but now see, here's the trick. What do you think white folks said when those very questions were put to them in 1963 and in 1962? At a time when the apartheid system in this country was very much in full effect. It was before the Civil Rights Act, before the Voting Rights Act, before the Fair Housing Act. In retrospect, we can all look back and say how profoundly unequal it was. How profoundly unequal it was. And yet when white folks were asked, some of them our parents, our grandparents, great uncles, great aunts, these ancestors of ours, right, were asked the very same question in 1963. Do you think that people of color, they didn't use that term, it said racial minorities. Do you think that racial minorities are treated equally in your community? And 80% of white folks said yes. In 1962, when Gallup asked, do you think that black children receive equal educational opportunity in your community? 90% approximately of white folks said yes. Nothing to see here. What is all this complaining? What is this March on Washington? I don't get it. I don't understand it. In fact, the very month of that march, which now it seems like every white liberal wants you to believe they were at. The very month of that march, white folks were asked by Newsweek what they thought about it. They said, 2/3 of whites said that Dr. King and the movement were pushing too far, too fast, asking for too much, and too soon. The idea that this country was ready to hear this, even at the time when we know how vicious it was, is a lie. What does it say that white folks were in denial in 62 and 63? What does it say that if you'd gone back to the 30s and asked the question? You think white folks were clear then? The 1890s, what did white folks say? Those southern editors of newspapers where I'm from, they would say, well, we get along fine with our Negroes down here if you Yankees would just leave us alone and stop messing in our business. Go back to 1850. And read what Dr. Samuel Cartwright, a well-respected member in good standing of the medical profession in this country, said. Not only was racism not a problem, there wasn't even a word for that yet, slavery wasn't a problem, so much so that he decided that any slave who would run away obviously had a mental illness, because you'd have to be crazy to run away from bondage. So he came up with a term, he called it drapetomania. Don't even know what the root of that is, don't want to know, don't understand where the word came from, but that's what he called it, drapetomania. You must be crazy, you must be mentally ill to run away from your loving master. Denial. In every generation, 2007, 1963, the 30s, the 1890s, the 1850s, my point being that in every generation, members of the dominant group have said there is no problem, and in every generation, without fail, we have been wrong. And in every generation, people of color, those who are the targets of that oppression and subordination, have said there is a problem, and in every generation, without fail, they have been right. So the question for us today is, what are the odds, honestly, that people of color who have never gotten it wrong have suddenly lost their frickin' minds and have suddenly become unable to see truth and to separate it from fiction? And counter to that, what are the odds that white folks who have never gotten it right yet have suddenly become highly, highly perceptive? The odds are pretty long. And again, it's not because white folks are insensitive or hard-hearted, let alone stupid, but it is that those of us who are white have the luxury of not knowing black and brown truth. We don't know because we don't have to know. We are not tested on it. If I don't know what people of color experience, what happens to me in this country? Virtually nothing. But if people of color don't know my reality, if people of color don't know white reality better than white folks have to know it, if they cannot regurgitate it to us better than we would ever be able to regurgitate it to ourselves, all hell breaks loose. So people of color are going to have to know white history, white literature, white art, white theater, white poetry, white drama. I know we don't call it that. That's sort of the point. When your stuff is the stuff against which everybody else's stuff is compared and found lacking, you don't have to name it. It's just the norm. That's why, for those still confused, we don't have White History Month, because we have several. They go by the tricky names of May and June, July, August, September. Pretty much any month that we have not designated as someone else's month, that's White History Month. But we take it for granted because we don't have to know other folks' reality. That's a privilege. That's an advantage. That's a head start. And it's one we must think about. See, that's the...
Is that it, Cindy?
Thank you, Sarah.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think of that? What did you think of that in hearing that? He has a very, very outspoken agenda and can say it very, very clearly. I'm wondering what you thought. Sachi. Sachi, can you speak to that?
Hi, yes, I found it very powerful. I now feel really motivated to find it and post it on Facebook and share it with white people I know. Well, people I know, but yeah, other white people especially. Yeah, I'm very moved by it, and I agree with what he was saying.
And Casey, do you want to speak out what you have in the chat? I'm not quite seeing it. Or Sarah, can you read it?
I'm sorry, which one am I reading?
Stacy?
Stacy.
No, I think it's Casey.
Yeah, hi everyone.
Casey. On. Oh.
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah. Hi, Cindy. I
Hi.
just thought it was really powerful. It made me think about curriculum and how, you know, whitewashed it is, and history in general, and how much work to be done is just in that section. Like but that was very powerful.
Did it make any of you who are educators in the classroom think about what you need to bring to the classroom, or your own experience and what you have learned in school and how that has shaped you?
Yeah, certainly, or just haven't really learned in the classroom, rather. You know, I mean, that's the main thing. I know that as an English teacher, we're incorporating, you know, more African literature into the curriculum, but not enough. I mean, it could be, I mean, we did a really good job. We started with Washington Black. We read When Things Fall Apart, but it just needs to be like across the board. I don't think it should just be in English, you know, just the humanities across the board. History is really important.
Yes. Yes, and I might be so bold as to say that it's almost as though, at least I had to do that for myself. I had to go back. I had to go back and relearn history because I'd only been taught information from one lens, through one lens. And I started to wonder when I learned about Asian history, what was the contribution of people of color rather than just the basic information that someone tells you about Asia? What happened with the indigenous people there? When I learned about American history, what was the contribution of people of color there? When I learned about the history of the UK, what's the history there that sits around people of color that I just never knew? And what are all the contributions that people have made?
Yeah, it feels like so much unpacking needs to be done there, whereas it just, like in secondary school, it feels like it go very quickly through that, right? Somehow that has to be a more like focused area that people tend to go on to in higher education. It's like, well, I'm learning that now because I'm choosing to study that. But it needs to be rewired from the secondary perspective. You know, that this is, you know, I mean, I used to have a class in high school that was American history. It was like, it felt like all we ever learned about was American history. You know, why can't it just be history, right? And U.S. history a part of it. We actually had a class of American history. It was like, it felt like it was the only history we were learning.
Yeah, required subject.
Yeah, not enough. Not enough. Not enough like worldview.
Well, and it wasn't actually the American view either. It was a slice of the American view. It was the white slice.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Absolutely.
Right. Jonathan.
Yeah, I want to raise based on what Casey was just saying, sort of a psychological, cultural issue about the Montessori world and get people's impressions. Cindy, I think one of the gifts that you're giving, I'll just speak for myself, is you're moving me into a zone of discomfort where I really not only need to be aware of my own biases, but I need to do some serious historical research, you know, because I have lived in my white bubble. And I'm wondering what everybody's opinion is. You know, we're very strong in peace education in Montessori, but I'm wondering whether, and this has been my experience as a consultant a little bit, I think, I'm wondering whether there's a little shadow side to Montessori peace education, that we're a little bit adverse to bringing up difficult issues with children, with ourselves as staff, and with parents about things that need to be unmasked. That we're so on the peace education, let's be peaceful, let's make nice, let's be nonviolent conflict resolution at the peace table, that we're a little adverse to raising difficult issues or asking hard questions. And I think that's something that, if I'm onto something here, that we Montessorians need to look at. You can be a peace educator and still raise really important questions that make everybody feel uncomfortable, because that's part of the transformational experience.
John, you raise a really good point. We've, as the Montessori Foundation and IMC, over the years, done a lot of work with people who are not people of color, but have really tried to help us to rethink this. I'm thinking of Dr. Rianne Eisler, the Center for Partnership Studies, challenging us to rethink our curriculum to go deeper. So there are Montessorians we know who were inspired by that and have read her book, Tomorrow's Children Are Beginning to Do Things. But your point's really well taken. This is challenging, and many of us wonder, I suspect, about what our parents would think if we address this sort of thing with young children. So we have to have a way, like with sex ed and so forth, to find a way to be brave and to have the conversations.
Yeah, I don't think we often recognize that what we're doing now is revolutionary. That when you look at the fact that education from its inception was racist and was designed to colonize people and was restrictive of gender, it was the dividing line between freedom and non-freedom. And so if you were a woman, you couldn't learn. If you were Black, you couldn't learn. And that's the basis, that's the underpinning of education. And it's also the underpinning of most countries. We're about to recognize July 4th, and what we did in America, what happened in America was horrendous. But what we have to do now is to take that beginning, to give children the knowledge that they really need to have, to do the work that we really need to do, and to completely unpack and revolutionize something that becomes peace. That's a major undertaking, but it is what we've been given as our challenge to do. In this field and what we do here, that's what we're supposed to be doing. And so it's so much bigger than the material on the shelf and the ground rules and the environment. All of it is directly connected to completely shifting a paradigm, completely unearthing and redoing the entire world as it was originated and creating it into something else.
Cindy, we have a couple of hands up I'd like to get to. James McGee has had his hand up. And then I think Lisa Reiner, and is that you, Patricia, that I'm seeing over there? So we'll try to pull in. I'm still trying to monitor that, and we have several things in the chat we'll get back to as well. So James, if you could unmute and go first, we'd love to hear from you.
Okay, thanks so much. So I really appreciate so much of what people are sharing, and especially the part about, obviously we're educators in the classroom, and so what's going to happen for us? I had a great teacher, a Montessorian named Rosemary Fleck. Some of you may know her. Her daughter runs a Montessori school in Charleston, South Carolina. That alone is an opportunity to be in Charleston, right? A center for the slave trade, and in South Carolina, like the cradle of the Civil War and the CSA. But so when you're saying, right, what do we do? We are Montessori guides. Some people call Montessori teachers guides. History is constructed of fact and opinion, but what is one man's fact or woman's fact is another person's opinion. So I think having children from the start, helping them to try to distinguish how they distinguish fact from opinion in their own thought processes and what they read and hear and see, like this bias study. What a great idea. And then help children understand that with fact, with opinion, if we have a growth mindset, then what we maybe today hold as fact, we can later dig in and look at it and say, why do I call this a fact? You know, what's the supporting evidence to calling this a fact? Perhaps it's an opinion. Doesn't make it bad or good. Can we ever sometimes look at a fact or opinion and withhold judgment for the moment as whether it's bad or good. It simply is something that needs consideration, because we're very quick to judge, right? And have to make this good and make this bad. You know, Rosemary taught us as children when we were studying history. It was around the time of the Attica riots. Do you remember the Attica riots, everybody in the prison? And we were just kids, and she had different source material and saying, you know, this is the media. Here's source material from the media coming from Time Magazine or Miami Herald or the Miami News, which doesn't exist anymore. The News doesn't exist anymore. The Herald is there. I'm thinking now that we didn't read Garth Reeves' Miami Times. Garth Reeves is, you know, African-American, and he had a paper that had a distinct perspective of being, you know, published by and owned by an African-American in Miami. But Rosemary, as enlightened as she was, that wasn't something she put her hands on at the time. So that was a source that we didn't even get to analyze as kids. And I'm even thinking now, wow. So what do we do for children? If our parents, and they are cut across a great spectrum, you know, and I don't think anybody wants their child to be indoctrinated. I think they want their child to learn how to be a free and independent thinker who can draw their own conclusions. I think having children consider the source of the information, how to analyze it, how to try to distinguish fact from opinion, how to identify their own biases, and maybe identify implicit or not implicit overt bias in what they're looking at. And then as we look back at history and say, okay, this history book was written in 1963 and this history book was written in 2011, you know, you can have a book written in 2020. It doesn't make it any more valid than something that was necessarily written in 1789. If you're reading Frederick Douglass's work, his work has a lot of validity, right? From his point of view about what he has to say about race and what happened in America at that time. And then if you read a quote unquote liberal abolitionist at the same time, what is there that's similar or different than what Douglass says? And then of course, if you read somebody who's clearly, let's say, a racist, anti-abolitionist person. So for us to get children to do the work, because it's hard work, and for us to do the hard work of finding source material to offer them and saying, you know, I found you some source material, but it's not exhaustive. But at least I tried to find you some source material. And here's what I can tell you about this author. This person, you know, this is when they were born. This is some of their life circumstance. And that's part of what informs their point of view as they created this source material. I think that that's really a challenge. And the younger the child gets, right, the more we have to bring it down to what works for that child. You know, Southern Poverty Leadership Council, the SPLC, has a program called Teaching Tolerance. And my wife said, I've got such a problem with that program. The name of the program just doesn't resonate with me because tolerance is not enough. And I said, you know, I understand, honey, but if you know anything about the SPLC, I think it's a good organization. I'm just going to say so. But I think they come from a place of, let's start with tolerance, because compassion and empathy has to come from the heart. But maybe you can make a rational decision to be tolerant, and then you can reach your heart. You know, so what a big challenge we have here. So anyway, I honor all of you who are in the classroom every day. You know, I'm a school headmaster, and I only teach a little bit every day, and it's not history, it's math. But I'm even thinking in my little bits of math teaching, if there's ways of my interjecting something of value to the children that would have them consider, you know, that math is for everybody and everybody can do math, and people throughout history have all made contributions, you know, I think that would be valuable to the children, because sometimes we compartmentalize, you know, subject areas, you know. So anyway, there's so much to say, but thank you for letting me just speak a little bit and chime in. And thank you all for all your great work.
Thank you, James. You know, what you were saying is very interesting. And what's unique about this situation that has happened over time, though, is that the information that people have been fed through books that teachers have trusted, they have grown up with, that children have trusted as coming from their educators, is that it is true. And what we have discovered is that there is a lot that is in history that is not left up to the opinion, but that is not true. And there's a lot of things in history that were not allowed to be spoken, not allowed to be printed, that were kept quiet and under wraps. And over time, people have started to say it and speak it and find dialogues of people who have their own lived experience, slaves and masters, who have provided truth to what has been squelched for so long. And as guides, we need to guide. For children, for years and years, to have not seen themselves in history and to have had another view of what truth was and what really occurred in history is a disservice to them as peacemakers. And so I think that a guide owes it to the children not to have them sort through many books that are already untrue, trying to find the thread of evidence, but to give them the information that is, so that they can start on a path that doesn't have to begin with their trying to identify themselves in history that they cannot find, or not understanding what had occurred, or having a completely warped view of what it was.
I totally get where you're coming from. For example, In Search of Black History by Bonnie Greer is available in Audible right now. And what is appealing to me about Bonnie's work is that the caption says, it brings you face to face with people who you never knew existed, people whose stories tell us different tales about who we all are. And so in Bonnie's work, it's multiple episodes. She's basically saying, this is Black history that was never taught, and sometimes squelched, and sometimes simply not even studied, so that the evidence was never there for anybody to have shared. So what she's saying, it's a new time in history where people are, like, as you say, going back and saying, let's look at what's certainly patently untrue. And so what I think is valuable to the children at any age that we teach them, if you teach a book it has a title, it has an author. And if they understand that there's an author, that's important, right? So that when we give them information, very general information is great, and maybe it doesn't need an author, but at a certain point in time, I think it's really good for them to understand, like, for example, source material can be provided, right? And if it can, then let's go ahead and say, this is what this author says about this piece of history. Like Bonnie Greer, you can, if you're a teacher and you're assembling lessons, you could use Bonnie and say, she's a source of this information. Because I think it's really important that children very young can consider the source of where the information is. Because if whatever is being taught as fact next year or in 2 years or 3 years, certainly it's a fact that the information was squelched. Even the fact that it was squelched is something that can be, evidence can be provided. You know what I mean? Really important information can be provided. There's evidence that this history was not told. Like, for example, how many African Americans even were able to make a contribution to a history book or a textbook that was adopted in the United States in the 1960s? And how many even today? And that's one reason I have a problem with history textbooks as opposed to primary sources. And I agree with you. Yeah, you can't expect the children to sort through it all. So as a guide, you have to provide them, right, with various material. And so I honor that work, because that'll be the work of a lot of folks to share with the curriculum that they're writing, what source material they are providing their children. I'm really looking forward to it. I see somebody's talking about Howard Zinn. Howard's been around for a while, but I still think Howard's got a lot of currency.
There are a lot of resources being added to the chat. So remember, you can save the chat there. And thank you, James, for that. I think we're all looking at, how we can explore this differently, especially with students. I know, I just want to remember that we have Lisa and Patricia waiting. So Lisa, and then Jonathan, I see you're ready as well. So Lisa.
I just wanted to tag on to what Jonathan had said about dealing with peace education in Montessori. And I think, I mean, I work with 2-year-olds as well as having the school. So I spend a lot of time talking and helping them see different perspectives, because they are honestly surprised, some adults are honestly surprised that somebody else actually has a different reality than them and a different perspective than them, and completely experiences their actions differently than they realize. So that part of it's kind of fun. And that's why I love doing it with young kids, because they honestly don't know and their hearts are so open. So they really do want to know. But even with older kids, even with us, it's not about being in our comfort zone. It's about realizing that our comfort zone isn't the only zone, and that other people have different perspectives, and we can impact them in a way we don't intend to, but it's still our impact, and it's still our responsibility for how we impact others and how we impact society. So I think it does tie into the peace curriculum, because peace curriculums aren't comfortable. Social justice isn't comfortable. If it was comfortable, we wouldn't need social justice, because everyone would be treated fairly and humanely. And we shouldn't be comfortable as long as people are not treated as humans. It is just, it is uncomfortable, and we absolutely should be uncomfortable. And it's hard to watch, and it should be hard to watch. But I don't think we get the option of opting out of dealing with the reality that surrounds us and then impacts people. I think that's just irresponsible to me. So I think there is a place for it in the peace curriculum, and I think it can be broken down pretty easily, and it does it beautifully with young kids. So that was all.
You know, Lisa, you bring to mind the dichotomy that we encourage children to go to peace tables and talk very directly and honestly about their issues. But when it comes to social justice, I don't want to bring that up because that's a social justice issue. It's like, so we actually have peace tables where kids are hopefully respectfully, but also brutally or candidly honest with each other. Do we need to do the same thing on a cultural and racial level? So Helen, I've been looking at a question and a point that Helen made that's very similar to where Lisa just took us in the chat. It can be challenging to wade into areas that might be in direct conflict with parents' views. If you live in areas of the country where there is not a lot of diversity or there is more overt racism, how deep do you walk into it? It's definitely worth being brave and going for it, but we have to be ready to back it up. Wonderful point. Cindy, do you want, or anybody want to address that? Great point.
I can address that if you'd like. In our school, I went from a very culturally diverse school to a school that's well, virtually all white, not all white, but virtually. And I actually had been using a curriculum that I developed when I was in the culturally diverse classroom because I'm teaching diversity, or what I would say anti-racism by education, by talking about facts. In the early childhood classroom, we talk about, we're in the sensorial area of the classroom where we talk about color, where we talk about what causes different color in skin and then we talk about the human body, and we talk about just all the different things that have to do with sensorial issues in the early childhood classroom, and that directly has to do with anti-racism, or embracing all humans and seeing all humans as equal. And then when we go up into the elementary classroom, then comes more facts about history and that sort of thing. And I know that I was very leery of bringing in teaching tolerance lessons, comprehension lessons, concerned about what parents would think. And I still get a little shaky with it. However, I've turned it into a Montessori upper elementary classroom work, comprehension work, which it's just part of our curriculum, where it's a comprehension work where children are required to do 1 or 2 of those a week so that they're reading about social justice and they're understanding that other people live differently than we do in our community, and that they know that there's other people, you know, that don't look like us out there, and they're not just on television. Because I grew up in this specific community as well, knew that there were other people of color, but had very little contact. And these children are in a similar situation. And so I'm trying to take them out so that they're in a culture and culturally diverse areas. And I also am exposing them to literature that are from culturally diverse areas. I have a lot of Islamic books that are lessons and poetry and that sort of thing. I try to put everything I can into the classroom so that our children, they have a choice. They have a choice as to what they are going to decide to be. And I can't make my children anti-racist, but what I can do is I can show them that there's more than one way. And I know that I did this when I divorced my husband, is that I knew that he would show them his way, and I would provide the children with another way, and that they would make choices, and hopefully they would pick the best parts of both sides. And that's what I'm hoping to do with the children in the curriculum that I've developed in the last 10 years or so. I'm hoping that it will let the children see that there's more than one way to look at things. So it is difficult, and I do get nervous when I send home those comprehension works and the parents see the questions on them. And but I haven't heard anything negative yet. So, and I have the full support of my administrator, who is sitting here with us as well. So
you've obviously done a great job on a curricular level. I think the spirit of Helen's question, if I'm understanding it, Julie, is, well, what do you do if parents, either because they've lived in a sort of a homogeneous white bubble, why are we going in this direction, or frankly, racist parents, what do you do when you do get parent pushback?
What we've done,
go ahead, Julie.
Kathy?
I'm sorry. Actually, I haven't had any, I'll finish just real quick. I haven't had any parent pushback, but that doesn't mean that there hasn't been any. So that, you know, they might quietly disappear. But that's the way it's been in our school. I haven't had any pushback. In fact, I've had parents come and say thank you. So for endorsing their way of thinking as well in this particular community.
I think this is a topic we've gotten so many questions about that, and Cindy and I talked about this in the planning because this question comes up so regularly about parent pushback. So I do think that it's something that we will probably devote a little more time to. We have limited time left, and I know Karen Kelly has been waiting to have a comment, and there's a few more things in the box. I want to make sure that we have time for Cindy to also move us in the direction that she would like to today. So Karen, I'll go to you first, and then we'll come back to Cindy.
Well, thank you. First of all, I just want to say, which I would say when I was teaching for 20 years in a Montessori adolescent program, I would say at faculty meetings, thank you to the Children's House teachers, lower L, upper L teachers for preparing the kind of human being that I received as a 7th and 8th year guide. Having taught in the public schools 10 years prior to that, and in a private schools for 5 years as well, it's like a new paradigm in education for me. Montessori was, and is, sorry. Anyway, I'm excited. I think I get excited about Montessori because it is offering us a chance for a new story. And it's offering us a chance to see that human beings can live principled lives. And just as a part of my adolescent curriculum that we would study, we would look at Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We would study Kohlberg's stages of moral developments as we read Antigone or whatever, so that Montessori is begging us or asking us, from my perspective, how do you create, not how do you create, how do you allow the child to continue to develop what is so wonderful about what is in that child? And I saw again in adolescence behaviors and characteristics and traits that I rarely saw in other environments. And there's something incredibly inspiring and hopeful going on in Montessori. And I really hope that we can somehow figure out how to get it out there for more people, for everyone, not just the wealthy. Thank you.
Sure.
Kathy, can I express something? I wanted to jump back just for a moment about what if your whole population in that school happens to be white, and it doesn't address so much the pushback from parents, which I think is a great conversation to put more time into, but it's very important that we pull the diverse population into the classroom in books, in the doll choice for doll washing exercises, you know, that there are many, many ways to broaden the population of your room without having to change your students. Now, you can also reach out and draw more of the people of color in your communities into your school, but that's a different topic. But even if you can't address that yet, you can address the library that you use. And it's not about the library that teaches a specific holiday or this child's story about being Black, for example. It's about representing just a child going to the museum on a field trip that happens to be of color. That is, you know, and just fill those bookshelves with that. Don't be afraid to have more than 50% of your books be central characters that are not like the population in your classroom. Because when we reflect back the population of the classroom in the material that's there, it just reinforces it. And so I encourage people to really look at your libraries, cull through the library, take out what's outdated that might be there, take out what no longer serves, and fill it with stories, because there's a lot out there with all that's going on. There have been many, many lists provided, and we can put a couple in the chat too, but that's what I would encourage.
I'd love for everyone to pause to imagine something through a slightly different lens. I went to school in San Francisco in an entirely Black neighborhood. I went to school with books that only had people who were white, and history that was only about white Americans, except Carver and a couple of other here and there that I learned over the course of time. And the majority of the parent body were all Black parents. No one would question the fact that the teacher was teaching about the history of white people and that the books were all about white people. No one would question it because it was ingrained that you wouldn't, and that your race was not important enough to discuss, and that the only history was white history, and that the only people were white people, even though all of the other students in the neighborhood and in the school, in your classroom and in your family were Black. And so you're flipping the switch to do it the other way. And it shouldn't be, and I get that it is, but it shouldn't be that parents would question it, because it has been the other way for so long. And now what we're trying to do is to even it out and to say, actually, we want to flood our library with plenty of people of color, because this is how we're going to start to flip that switch, so that people start to honor, and yes, James, I agree with you around the word tolerance. People will start to honor people of color, and with that honor comes treating them differently. And so someone in the chat, I just kind of glanced at something about, should this be something that's in our parent handbook? Absolutely, and I would not call it anti-bias curriculum. I would call it cultural curriculum, that we're recontextualizing what we see as culture and what we understand about race, and that we're fixing a mistake that happened a long time ago, and that some of that starts with educating your parents and helping them to understand as well, because they have a part in how they frame what they tell their children about race and what they emulate about race as well. And so it's a bigger challenge that we have, but it's one that is fairer. It's fairer. Even in a classroom where there are absolutely no children of color, it is fairer to prepare them for the rest of the world by teaching them about the people that are missing from their classroom and are missing from their history, but were there, and you're making them visible. So Kathy, are we almost out of time?
We are, we're done. Well, we've got about 7 minutes left.
Oh my gosh, I have this exercise that's 30 minutes long, so I guess we have to do that.
Well, guess what, Cindy? I think we're inviting you back again next week. And I think that this conversation has plenty of opportunity to do your 30-minute exercise next week.
So, Kathy, do you mind, everybody, if I show you one more short clip? I think this one's 6 minutes, and then I'll wrap up.
Okay, sure.
Sarah, can you go to that?
Yes. Which one is it that you wished?
There's only one other one. It's a young white woman.
Okay.
From the UK. Michael would have enjoyed hearing this, and I don't think he's on today.
And while Sarah's doing that, I just want to remind everyone you can save the chat. The little buttons at the bottom of your chat box, the 3 little dots. Click on that, save your chat. There's lots of great comments and resources there.
Sorry, I need to re-choose.
Us white people really do not want to be called racist. I think the single biggest challenge that Black people have in talking to us about topics like race is how defensive we are. And I say we because I'm included in this, and I look back at past conversations that people have tried to broach with me, and my responses, even though I was thinking I was being nice or whatever, they are rooted in a defensiveness. If someone calls you out, if someone in your life is willing to have these discussions with you, listen. Just listen. Yeah, so I have been trying to have, especially in the last few days, more conversations about race with white friends and family. And I think it's fascinating when you hear things like, oh, but I have, like, don't worry, I'm not racist. I have a Black friend. I'm like, oh my gosh, those policemen are disgusting. Those are horrible people. I would never do that. I like rap music. I like Black people, you know, I'm not racist, those people are awful. And in making these comparisons, it's like you distance yourself from ever staring yourself in the mirror and actually thinking, am I at all racist? You condemn these people who've done very overt racist acts. And firstly, I want to say don't use Black people in your life as a token of your non-racism. It doesn't work like that. But secondly, I want to look at racism as a scale, because something I've been thinking about in the last few days is that I think a lot of white people see being racist as an extreme. So you either are racist or you are not racist, and no one wants to be considered racist, so you defend yourself to be this. No white person ever wants to admit that they have looked at a Black person in a hoodie and associated it with fear. And no white employer ever would admit that they would rather hire someone who looks like them than someone who is Black. No one wants to be seen as a bad person, and racism obviously is a bad thing. But racism is not a binary extreme. It is a scale. No one is entirely not racist, including me. Maybe even especially me. And the reason is because we are raised into a society where the systems around us are inherently racist. It's like if you look at the way that our countries are formed, a lot of them are very problematic. Take America. America is literally built off of stealing the territory of Indigenous people, murdering Indigenous people, enslaving an entire race, and then finally forcing Black people to go through like a whole civil rights movement to like kind of have some rights, but like the laws and the systems around haven't actually changed that much. Or like we like to demonize America, but look at the UK, like we are built on imperialism, colonialism. We are a country that has stolen cultures, rewritten cultures. Look at our museums. The British Museum, guys, is literally just made of stolen artifacts from other countries that we don't really have a claim to. I mean, in Britain, look at Grenfell Tower, look at Stephen Lawrence, look at social mobility rates in ethnic minorities, look at stop and search rates, and then also just try and explain the whole like systemic thing. Look at our media. Representation matters so much more than we all care to admit. But as a kid, you want to watch shows where people who look like you are represented in a positive way. Like, that makes a difference to your psychology, the aspirations you set for yourself, the way you view yourself. And the representation of Black people is shocking. It's like children are raised to believe that the dazzling Disney princess main character is white, and that the sidekick or the token principal of the school or the villain sidekick or just some random character that they can shove in to have some kind of diversity and tick that checkbox, that is often the role that the Black person has fallen into. Let's look to when you are a child and you're getting out your Crayola coloring pencils and you are asked to do a self-portrait of yourself. You know that peachy, fleshy color? I don't know about you, but I was raised to call that color skin color. Like, oh hey, can you pass the skin color so I can like draw myself? What was the Black person next to me meant to do when they're asked to draw themselves, literally express their identity, and the only option is something called skin color, which doesn't match their own skin color? So already as a child they're being taught that they don't fit whatever society is like deeming the correct one. So then do they just have to pick up the black crayon and use black, or do they try and like fit themselves into this narrative by using the skin color? Like that's deep. Look at our CEOs and our leaders. I don't know the statistics off the top of my head, but I do know that representation of Black people in those higher positions is a lot lower than white people. Look at wealthier regions of the country and the demographics of people who occupy them. And if you even look into history, in America, for example, there was this thing called redlining. This literally meant that you could only live in a certain area if you were a certain race. Almost everything about the way we think, the way we operate, the opportunities that I have, that another person next to me has, you can trace it back into history, and the history has defined the system that you're now in, and the system affects you whether you realize it or not. It is shown that as early as the age of 2.5, children use the idea of race to pick their playmates in the playground. Imagine that, like you only show a kid racist media, or you do the whole, you know, skin color crayon thing, and then you ask them like, who do you want to play with in the field? Like already at the age of 2.5, white kids are starting to have a preference towards being with the white kids. Everything I'm saying about kids I learned from the Instagram page Conscious Kids. I highly recommend you check them out. So when someone says I am not racist, it's like, hey, I know you haven't shot a Black person, well done, but my friend, you are probably racist, quite simply because we have all been taught to be. I also just want to say I see you and I reckon you are a really nice person. Being a nice person does not make you not racist. In upholding the systems around us which are built on racism, doesn't that mean that it is ingrained in us all? Okay, just to add something new. You've probably seen this a lot on social media and I just want to echo it. It is no longer enough to be not racist. We must be actively anti-racist. If you are not doing something every day to either work on your subconscious biases, to have conversations with people who it is necessary to have conversations with, to share necessary posts, to just think in your mind that day about your identity in the world and what you can do, and you are not rewriting the underlying mindset that the system has taught you to have, and you are not trying to violently combat something that really needs violently combating. Okay, now
Thank you, Sarah.
Wow.
Isn't that a young person who has something to say? Wouldn't it be incredible if that was a young person who'd been taught by us and came out with that? That's the result of what we want in our classrooms, is someone who sees it and recognizes it and speaks out. And I don't remember her name, but I do know that she had a series of her going through this process of awakening and saying, "Oh my gosh!" Well, from saying this is a bunch of baloney to saying, "Wait a minute, I'm learning more," and then taking herself through her own trajectory of where she came to now. And so her piece is probably 4 times this length. But it's really marvelous. Sarah, I don't know if you can put it in the link, but if you happen to want to take a look at it, she's quite. Oh, wonderful. Okay. So let me wind up by saying that what we are going to be doing next week is an exercise that involves having your camera on and turning your camera off in response to some things that I'm mentioning to you. And we'll have our regular discussions as well, but this is one exercise that we're just going to take everybody through. And so I hope you will all feel comfortable enough to have your cameras on and then to have them on or off in response to what it is that we're talking about next week. So I want to just remind you that we're ending with 4th of July coming up. And Kathy, do I have time to just read a piece of a poem?
You have time to do whatever you'd like, my friend, and we will expect that adults will do what they have to do if they have to leave, but please proceed.
So this poem is by a woman named Sonia Sanchez. It says, and it's for July 4th. And I invite you to also Google this weekend, July 4th in the Eyes of Black Americans. You might find it interesting. But she says, it is essential that we always repeat, we the people, we the people, we the people. This is the time for you and me, African American, whites, Latinos, gays, Asians, Jews, Native Americans, lesbians, Muslims, all of us must finally bury the elitism of race superiority, the elitism of sexual superiority, the elitism of economic superiority, the elitism of religious superiority. So we salute you and say, come, 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 move out into this world. Nourish your lives with a spirituality that allows us to respect each other's birth. And if we nourish ourselves, our communities, our countries, and say, no more Hiroshima, no more Auschwitz, no more Wounded Knee, no more Middle Passage, no more slavery, no more Bosnia, no more Rwanda, no more intoxicating ideas of racial superiority. As we walk toward abundance, we will never forget the earth, the sea, the children, the people. For we, the people, will always be arriving, a ceremony of thunder waking up the earth, opening our eyes to human moments. And it'll get better. It'll get better. So this July 4th date holds a different view in the eyes of many people, as it did for African Americans decades ago. But with every challenge, I think that we can cry out, we can create anew, we can speak truth to justice and to freedom until we all have justice and freedom. And so I encourage you to think of that this weekend. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cindy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy and Sarah. Thank you, everyone who, some of you, it's your first time coming. You're always welcome to come back. We host this town hall on this particular subject every Friday at 3 p.m. So enjoy your holiday and also reflect on where we are in our history and what our opportunities are for the future. So thank you again on behalf of the Montessori Foundation and the International Montessori Council. We appreciate you being here and engaging with us in this very important work.
Be safe this weekend.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Kathy. Thanks, Jonathan. And thanks to everybody for being here. Kathy, I'm going to stop the recording.